Tonight, we begin with development that military analysts, Western intelligence officials, and frontline observers had feared, dismissed, and quietly tracked for months. A development that unfolded not over years, but in hours. Hours that left Russian units disoriented. Hours that collapsed defensive positions. Hours that resulted in sudden, unexplained fatalities near Kupiansk. What Russian forces did this week crossed a line that Ukrainian command and international observers had hoped would never be tested. And when that line broke, Ukraine's defenders did not hesitate. They responded with speed, precision, and intent. For weeks now, there have been signals, not official statements, not press briefings, just patterns, that something unusual was taking shape around Kupiansk. Russian forces had been persistent, yes, but they had also become methodical in their persistence. Their movements followed a certain rhythm, a cycle, almost a routine. But what set off alarm bells in Ukrainian intelligence circles this week was that the routine stopped. Analysts who monitor battlefield behavior know the indicators. The disappearance of regular radio chatter, the absence of armored patrol rotations, the sudden halt in drone overwatch, and the unexplained silence in sectors that are never quiet. All of it went dark. And whenever a force like Russia's goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Early Tuesday morning, Ukrainian reconnaissance units detected what they described as non-standard battlefield anomalies, including movement signatures that had not been observed in over a year of fighting. These are the kinds of battlefield changes Russian forces only risk when they are signaling something specific, a test, a trap, or a desperate adaptation. Observers didn't immediately know which category this fell into, or whether it was all three at once. But what they did know was that Russia was altering its tactical posture. And when a military force changes posture without explanation, even slightly, commanders pay attention. The internal warning circulated among Ukrainian units that night was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Sources briefed after emergency command meetings described Russia's move as irregular, uncharacteristic, and most importantly, dangerous because it suggested improvisation. But improvisation only works if the opponent hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, the response that followed was among the fastest adaptive reactions seen on this front in months. Within hours of confirmation, Ukrainian units adjusted their operational posture. These weren't standard countermeasures. They were specialized offensive responses, tools and systems Ukraine reserves for moments when the battlefield itself becomes unpredictable beyond nightfall. Ukrainian sources confirmed that Russian losses around Kupiansk were not the result of a conventional clash. There was no major artillery duel, no sweeping armored assault, no dramatic breakthrough. Instead, Russian units were being neutralized in small clusters. They hit exposed forward elements. They hit command link positions. They hit support units preparing to reinforce. In other words, Ukrainian forces target the connective tissue of Russia's presence, the components that make an operation function. This is what made earlier warnings so urgent. Russia's move wasn't symbolic. It was experimental, and experimental warfare, when it fails, kills its own operators first. Ukraine responded not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't strike blindly. They didn't overextend. They hit precisely where disruption mattered. And here's where the story becomes even more unsettling. Analysts now believe Russia's latest maneuver was designed to test Ukrainian responsiveness after months of sustained pressure. Moscow wanted to see whether Ukraine would hesitate, whether exhaustion had set in, whether reaction times had slowed. Instead, the opposite happened. Ukraine didn't delay. They responded with a speed so disciplined and so calculated that even Russian commanders took notice. You don't surprise a military that's been at war this long easily. But this time, Ukraine did. One defense analyst speaking anonymously described Russia's move as forced innovation, a gamble born from constraint. But Ukraine proved it remains both adaptive and alert. Its response was not only fast, it was accurate enough to neutralize the threat without escalation. That matters because it shows something critical. Ukraine is not reacting blindly anymore. It is anticipating as reports continue coming in throughout the day. The scale of the response became clearer. Ukrainian infantry units repositioned, forcing Russian forward elements to withdraw. Drone reconnaissance targeted staging zones that had gone quiet days earlier. Electronic countermeasures disrupted coordination used to support the maneuver. This wasn't just defense. This wasn't just containment. This was operational denial. This was battlefield control. And control is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since the front stabilized. For every advance attempted, Ukraine has countered with disruption rather than confrontation. Remember, Russia believed several things at the start of this phase. They believed Ukraine was overstretched. They believed reaction times would slow. They believed improvisation could compensate for pressure. But tonight, the opposite is happening. Ukraine remains responsive. Ukraine remains disciplined. Ukraine remains aware. What makes this moment so dangerous and so revealing is that Russia's move came as its leadership faces mounting pressure. Commanders want progress. Political leaders want results. Logisticians want stability. Field units want relief. Russia is balancing all of this while sustaining a long, grinding conflict. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not acting from strength. They're acting from pressure. They're acting from vulnerability that Ukraine's official statements, now circulated through military briefings, were designed to signal that Kyiv is not willing to allow unpredictable escalation. Officials stated plainly that Russia's actions were inconsistent with battlefield norms. That's diplomatic language for, this was reckless. You don't usually hear that tone unless something serious has occurred. Meanwhile, Ukraine's leadership addressed the public in a measured, controlled address. The message was calm. There was no triumphalism, no exaggeration, just clarity. These were not rhetorical flourishes. They were statements from a government that understands the stakes. What makes this even more concerning is that the Kupiansk incident wasn't isolated. Along with the primary maneuver, Russian forces increased probing actions elsewhere. Support units shifted unusually. Surveillance activities spiked along adjacent sectors. All of it happened within the same window. When a force moves multiple pieces at once, it signals something larger. Analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia was preparing a localized breakthrough. Another is that it was attempting psychological pressure. The third, the most concerning, is that it was testing new battlefield methods. But today, Ukraine shut that door. They didn't hesitate. They didn't misread. They didn't overreact. They responded decisively. What we're watching now is a test of adaptability. Russia wants to see if innovation can substitute momentum. Ukraine wants to show that awareness beats surprise. International observers want to prevent escalation. All sides are watching closely. Tonight, sources say monitoring has intensified. They report no immediate follow-up. They report recalibration on the Russian side. And they believe this was part of a broader attempt to regain initiative. But Ukraine is not reactive. Ukraine is prepared. Their response, measured, targeted, and controlled, sent a message to Moscow. And it sent reassurance to allies that as the days go on, more details will emerge about what Russia hoped to achieve. But what we know now is this. Ukraine's response was timely. It prevented escalation. It preserved control. What happens next depends on Russia's next move. If restraint follows, this will be remembered as a warning. If not, Ukraine has already shown it is ready. And tonight, for the first time in days, Russia appears to be quiet. Kupiansk is still. Too still. And when Russia is quiet, it means planning. Because tonight, Russia learned something it has learned before. Surprise is no longer guaranteed. Silence is no longer safety. And adaptation cuts both ways. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Ukraine is watching. Ukraine is ready. And the battlefield is changing.